Hello, my name is Gregory Baldy, and I'm the chair of the Political Science Department here at Western Illinois University. Welcome to this first episode in our new series, Explorations in Political Science. This series will examine the political issues of interest and importance to the WIU community and will feature faculty and students from the Western Illinois University Political Science Department. Today's show considers the results of the 2022 midterm elections and what they mean for the region, the state, and the nation in the months and years ahead. Joining us to discuss the elections are Rich Egger, the news director at Tri-States Public Radio, where he covers state and local politics, Delilah Sanders, a Master of Arts candidate in the department's public administration concentration, and Dr. Keith Boeckelman, a professor in the department who teaches courses on Illinois and American politics and oversees the WIU Model Illinois Government Program. He'll be moderating our conversation today.
Thank you, Greg. So I'm glad to be here with our two guests to talk about the midterm elections. It used to be that midterm elections were considered kind of snoozers and really weren't that much worth paying attention to, but I think through much of this century, they've been very dramatic and important. So let me start by asking our panelists what their takeaways are from this 2022 midterm. And let me start with you, Delilah.
Well, I guess I would say my first main takeaways is kind of to your point at the beginning. Unless you were a political science student, you never really cared much about the midterm elections. I would have to drag my friends to help them understand, you guys need to vote, and well, this is why this is important. Now it seems that maybe with the advent of social media and basically what's been going on in the political sphere, people care a lot more, so that's important. Also, being a political science student, I was always under the impression historically, whoever is the president, their party is going to lose tremendously in the House and the Senate, regardless of which party it is. That's just what's going to happen in the midterm election. And I was fully expecting that, and it didn't happen. So I was very, very shocked, and I think my main takeaway is that if I were a Republican, I'd be kind of concerned, and it's be time to regroup because this did not go how they expected it to.
Okay, Rich, how about you?
Well, one of my takeaways would be if you're a Republican and you want to win office, run in McDonough County. Because every time a Republican, if voters had a choice between a Republican or a Democrat in McDonough County, Republicans came out on top. Second takeaway from the election on November 8th would be polling. Can we still trust pre-election polling? The results seem to be very far off compared to the results that we are seeing, and of course some results are still coming in.
Yeah, let me kind of pick up on, there's been a long time concern with polling, but let me kind of pick up on something Delilah mentioned also, which is the normal pattern is for the party of the president in their first term in the midterm elections to lose seats. And so if you look at the last four presidents, the Democratic presidents before Biden, Obama, Clinton, Carter, and Johnson, they on average, they lost 45 seats. It's not going to be anywhere near that this time. So I think, as Delilah was saying, there's not this typical midterm wave that we would expect. I wanted to talk about a couple of takeaways that I had too. One thing I was really concerned about or worried about before the election is this idea of election deniers controlling the machinery of elections, particularly at the Secretary of State level in many states. And that didn't really happen, I think with the exception of Indiana and maybe one or two other very strongly Republican states. None of the candidates for Secretary of State or head of election authorities who are running on this platform of Trump won in 2020 and Trump will certainly win in 2024 no matter what happens. None of those were elected, or none at least in the swing states. I think another thing that struck me is that we live in kind of a 50-50 country. And we've gotten used to these wave elections going back and forth, but with gerrymandering and other factors, I wonder how much that can even happen anymore. So, as Delilah kind of mentioned, we anticipated another wave and that didn't happen, but we do seem still very divided as we've seen in recent elections.
Yeah, the gerrymandering would definitely be an issue when you're talking about House races. But to see the Senate so evenly split, and there's not, gerrymandering doesn't come in with the U.S. Senate.
No, that's
so yeah, I would agree. I mean, we're seeing a very divided country right now, I think.
And the Senate, we have a 50-50 Senate right now. The most change we're going to see is maybe 51-49, depending on what happens in the Georgia runoff, or we may see another 50-50 split. So again, stay tuned to that. So were there any surprises that you saw in the election? And I think some of you have alluded to that a little bit, but particularly what the experts were expecting. I mean, I think as Delilah alluded to, the experts are kind of expecting a Republican wave, which didn't happen. Did anything else surprise you about the results? Maybe I'll start with you this time, Rich.
Well, I mean, that is the big surprise, obviously, that there was not this red wave. I think you may have had a blue wave if the election had been held in September. Maybe some of the anger over the overturning of Roe v. Wade had tampered down a little bit by the time November came around, but I still think you saw enough Democrats, and certainly Democratic women, motivated to get out and vote this time around, where perhaps in past midterm elections they might not have come out in those numbers. And I think that's part of the reason there was not that red wave, is because there was still some lingering resentment at some of the votes we've seen on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Delilah, how about you?
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And I also was speaking to your point about the surprise about the polarization, right? That necessarily does not surprise me, because I think ever since a post-Trump America, I think that's going to be commonplace for politics. This is just in my opinion. I did expect to see a little bit more turmoil, though. I didn't think that there was certainly not a whole lot of violence, a whole lot of news coverage on anything that was going back and forth. Another surprise to me was that we also, for the first time, we elected our first Gen Z representative to the House, which I thought was very, very interesting at 25. And as a member of that generation, I was like, oh, okay, Gen Z is coming, and we are actually participating in politics, because there is this overwhelming thought that young people do not care about politics. But I do think that we did hold our own for the midterm elections as percentages go. So I thought that was very, very surprising. And of course, on a national scale, Florida absolutely red, completely down. And I've always considered it to be a swing state, and it was not. So that didn't surprise me necessarily when it comes to the economy, but I did think that there was going to be some semblance of a swing state in Florida. So those were the three big surprises for me.
Delilah, you mentioned Gen Z voters. Yeah. Do you think they came out in large enough numbers to make a difference in this election in support of Democrats rather than Republicans?
I think it made all of the difference, honestly, because when I was on social media, I saw a lot of discourse on maybe we should raise the voting age from the Republican side, because they thought, they were like, our younger Gen Z, and Gen Z, the voting age is 18 to 25. The oldest of Gen Z is 25. So we've got the Republican side shaken a bit about how young voters go. And I also think Gen Z overwhelmingly supports Roe v. Wade, and that was a hot button issue. So I think that we did make a big difference in this election. We can do more. We're never going to hit, in a sense, the older generation, the boomers who always show out in the election season every time. But I think we're starting to take politics very seriously.
And I think along that line, there is a lot of exit polling evidence to suggest that Gen Z and, I guess, lower levels of millennials, younger age millennials went strongly for the Democrats. So that could kind of explain, in part, why we had this not red wave that we maybe expected. I think another thing that I've been thinking about just in terms of surprises and why we're surprised that there wasn't a red wave is I think sometimes we get caught up in this narrative, and like Rich alluded to, in the summer the narrative was, okay, the overturning of Roe versus Wade is going to lead to this Democratic wave perhaps, or Democrats holding their own, and then that seemed to kind of fade away, but based on fairly flimsy polling evidence, I think, and I think there's a lot of And I, as much as anybody, bought into this narrative. And people would ask me, well, about politics, what do you think? And so I would replay this narrative. Okay, the Republicans are going to win big, and the Democrats are going to lose, and that was wrong. But I got me to thinking about, why do we take these narratives so seriously? Why don't we just wait for the voters to decide, because then we'll know on election night?
Well, from the media standpoint, I think that's a real problem, is that we rely on all this polling in pre-election reporting instead of talking about issues. And it becomes more of a horse race rather than a campaign about issues, which raises another point for the two political scientists here. As you look back at it, are you surprised that we didn't see a stronger victory by Democrats, given that Republicans didn't really present a lot of ideas? There was a lot of criticism of Democrats, and you also had some, I guess for lack of a better word, lunatics running from the Republican side. So are you surprised we didn't see even a stronger victory by Democrats?
I'm not. And only the only key issue and the only reason why I say that is, just to put it simply, the economy's stupid. It just, with inflation on the way, or inflation now and the recession underway, it didn't surprise me. And that's why I, like Dr. Boeckelman, expected a Republican takeover, because of how poorly the economy is doing, especially with people who are voting. You're seeing the changes at all levels. You go into the grocery store, you see how high gas is, and I think that made more of the difference. Maybe in another year, if we were coming from, a post-COVID boom of economics, we would have seen something like that, but I foresaw people voting red because of that.
Should Democrats have made a stronger case that inflation was not something that, it was global inflation, it wasn't really something just in the country, in this nation?
It's one thing to present that case, but then people have to sit and actually listen to it and comprehend it. A lot of people, especially, Americans, you can say, oh, it's going on all over the world. I care about what's going on in my backyard and what my gas prices are. So they could have presented that case, and it could have fallen regardless.
I think also, I would say the Democrats should have made a bigger case for the low unemployment rate. You've got inflation, and that's certainly a negative for the incumbent party, but unemployment is great, by historical standards. It's 3.5% or whatever. So I was a little bit surprised they didn't make more of a case for that. But going back to your question, political scientists have all these models that they use to try to forecast elections. And if you break it down, it's really two things, and really echoing what Delilah said, the economy and the president's approval rating. And so the president's approval rating was pretty bad, 42%, and that you feed it into these models, and that suggests a bad Democratic result. And the economy's mixed, as Delilah also said, inflation was pretty bad. Again, I think the Democrats should have emphasized unemployment more, but I also think, going back to the point about a 50-50 country, there's a pretty narrow sliver of persuadable voters, and I think there are people on two sides that are not just going to persuade them. So I don't know how much the Democrats, or the Republicans for that matter, could have done. But kind of sticking with your point about issues, you mentioned abortion. Do you think that was a big issue in the campaign, or do you think there were other issues that were more important? What do you see as like Delilah mentioned the economy already? What do you see as the overarching issues that were really shaping this? And I guess I'll start with you on this one again.
Definitely the economy, for sure. When it comes to abortion, it feels kind of like what you mentioned at the beginning. It kind of like tapered off. I think it's because a lot of states had maybe codified certain things or put things into legislation that kind of, in a sense, calmed people down after the initial Roe v. Wade overturning. So also with this election, a lot of states passed different amendments and different things that, said that, we are going to protect Roe v. Wade. And so I didn't see much of that in the discourse specifically, but if you look at the voters, women showed out, and they particularly showed out for those who had their interests. So I think that's important. I also think, in an Illinois perspective, I think that a lot of Illinois voters maybe didn't think about it too much because we're considered a blue state, and JB, our current governor and previous governor, basically told us, he was like, in the beginning of his campaign, Roe v. Wade and abortion rights will be safe in Illinois. So it really wasn't much of a topic.
Yeah, that's kind of an irony. It looks like in some of the states like New York, for example, where people felt Roe versus Wade was safer, that probably helped the Republicans because the issue was kind of off the table.
Exactly.
And so the Republicans in some of these blue states didn't do as well as you might have expected. Well, what about you, Rich? Are there particular issues that you felt?
Well, to get to that point about abortion in New York, perhaps the difference with Illinois would be that we are surrounded by red states, and just knowing that there is at least this island here, the state of Illinois, where a woman's right to an abortion is protected, I think that may have helped inspire more women to come out and vote. I wonder how much it might have hurt Republicans to have so many election deniers running for office. I think that would scare some moderate Republicans, and there are still very many moderate Republicans, people who are not buying into this the election denier nonsense, and they may not have come out and voted, or they may not have voted in every race, and so that may have helped Democrats to a certain extent too.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence for that. You know, the Pennsylvania governor's race is one that comes to mind, where you had a strong election denier who ran way behind the not very strong Republican candidate for U.S. Senate, and you know, some of these other states where these Secretary of State candidates who were running for, you know, on an election denier platform did not do very well. So I think that's definitely a factor. I guess one other thing that strikes me that may have come into play is this idea of democracy under threat, and I guess that's related to what you just said about the election deniers. You know, President Biden tried to make this an issue before the election, and some people said, you know, that's too abstract, people don't really care about it. But there's at least some evidence from exit polling that it did make a difference. About 70% of the voters who are answering the exit polls said that democracy, or the threat to democracy, was at least a concern, maybe not their top concern, but at least on their minds when they're voting. And so I think that may have played in some of these results as well.
Yeah, I've lived a long time already, and I never thought I would see anything like this in the United States. This idea of alternative facts, this denying the result of the 2020 presidential election. What we saw on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol, I never thought I'd see anything like that in the United States, and I'm sure there are people who were thinking about that as they went and voted this time around too.
Well, and the democracy itself may be becoming a partisan issue, but it seems like maybe we backed away from that a little bit with what you were saying about moderate Republicans not being ready for the election deniers and so forth.
Exactly, but you know, and I think about that, you know, if I was kind of put myself, if I were a Republican strategist right now, I would be in a very tough spot, because you have these so-called Trump Republicans, but you also have these moderate Republicans. You can't ignore the Trump Republicans, but what do you do when you're trying to move forward your campaign? How do you address these people and include them, but not put them on the top platform? Because, you know, that's pretty much been, when people think of Republicans, they go automatically, oh, to the Trump, you know, make America great again. And of course, that's not the majority, but that's what the media likes to highlight. And so we're going to go into the 2024 election. How do you continue to allow those people in, but not allow the media circus to absolutely use those people and take away the strength from your platform? That's what I would really say.
Yeah, and Trump supporters, I believe, will continue to vote for Trump if he is on the ballot. But what we saw were a number of Trump-backed candidates did not do as well. So perhaps his power only extends just to that certain cult of personality, to Trump himself.
Well, sort of along that line, then, what do we think is the future for the parties going forward? What do the Republicans need to do to kind of regain their momentum? What do the Democrats need to do to overcome Joe Biden's low approval ratings in 2024? Do the parties need to change their policy positions or their messages? The situation we have right now, the kind of 50-50 divided country, is a little bit unusual in American history. Usually there's been a dominant party, you know, like the Republicans after the Civil War or the Democrats after the New Deal, but we've had this pretty closely divided situation where neither party has been dominant. Do you think that'll continue? What do the parties need to do if one were to become more dominant?
Well, I think Biden wanted to kind of present a New Deal, but he doesn't have enough support in Congress. There are not enough Democrats in Congress to push through everything he wants to push through, and especially with that, even though Democrats had that one vote thanks to the vice president's vote in the Senate the past couple of years, they just didn't have enough support to overcome any opposition in the party. And so that's going to be his challenge the next couple of years. Is it's still very closely divided in the Senate, and it is looking like Republicans are going to control the House by a narrow margin. So it's going to be difficult for him to sort of make his case and get a lot of his priorities passed in the next couple of years, and perhaps energize that Democratic base in the next couple of years. As for Republicans, the challenge is going to be who's going to run for president. If Trump announces he's running for president again, that's going to be a wild card in there, isn't it?
I think it will be. So do you think there are any messages that either Democrats or Republicans aren't using now, or policy positions they aren't using now that they need to use more?
Well, what I said earlier about Republicans, I heard a lot of complaints, but I didn't hear a lot of ideas. And I think they're going to need to present some solutions if they want to inspire voters in the next couple years. You can't just be the party of no, as the House was in the final 6 years under Obama, for example. I think you need to present some ideas and give an idea. Okay, if there are problems, it's fine to bring those up if there are problems, but what are your solutions? You know, I would say the same thing with the election deniers. It's fair to raise questions, and it's fair to raise some concerns, but at some point you have to provide some evidence. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of conspiracy theories. It's just a bunch of BS. You have to provide some evidence, and I would say for Republicans moving forward, you need to provide some solutions. That would be my opinion.
Okay, how about you, Delilah?
Well, as far as what the Democrats and Republicans could do, I mean, we could talk about that for like 6 hours about like what do we think they could do. However, I do think if I were a Democrat, if I was, a part of, I would be feeling actually pretty good. Despite my low approval rating, the midterm elections didn't go too bad for the Democrats. It could have been a lot worse, as we've seen in history. So what I would do if I were a Democratic advisor, I would continue to mobilize this up and coming generation, especially in the 2024 election, because we'll have more percentage of Gen Z and millennials who overwhelmingly are more open-minded, support Roe v. Wade, more in favor of, government-funded programs for poor people. So you need to continue to mobilize and not lose the momentum that you have, because it's very, very easily for people to get apathetic about politics, and they could just say, Gen Z, I did the voting thing for Trump and I got him out of office and that's it, I'm done, and they could move on with their lives. So I think they need to continue to keep the ball rolling and see how important it is. As for Republicans, I think it's time for, if it were me, it's time for a new front man, someone that maybe. Trump is entertaining and he has a lot of charisma and he is able to mobilize people to this, I guess it's hysteria, like these people who will willingly fight and believe anything that he has to say. But I think it's alienating some of the Republican base that's just not into all of that. So there could be, a new candidate like a Ron DeSantis who has a lot of the similar views as Trump, but maybe not as, I don't know, I don't want to... much of a character, a personality, not, a lot of people could describe Trump as his own sideshow. Maybe the Republicans would like to walk away from that and get back to the basis of what they believe. So that's what I would do.
But DeSantis is not beyond doing some sideshow stuff too,
Sure.
shipping immigrants to Martha's Vineyard, for example, sending them via plane up there. He's willing to pull some stunts too. I guess the question for Republicans would be, if they nominate someone else for president, if Trump runs in the primaries and does not get the nomination, does he run as an independent for president in 2024, or will he step aside? He doesn't seem like the type of person who's just going to quietly go into the night.
No,
and that would be a
not at all.
challenge for Republicans.
Yeah. And you're right about, Ron DeSantis is that, of course, he has his own smaller sideshow. But one thing about Trump is that since we had 4 years of him, there's an oversaturation in the media and the constant, we've got so many quotes. With DeSantis, we're not there yet. So he does have that advantage of, well, maybe by the 2024 election, I've been doing, Trump-like antics or sideshow type antics. Maybe he can dial it down a bit and present himself as a calmer, or I wouldn't say he's a moderate Republican, but someone who is, if I were DeSantis, I would market myself as, I have some of the similar ideas as Trump, but I am not Donald Trump. And you can trust me and to run the country, and that's how I would market it. And that's how I think that's what he's going to do, and I think that it's actually going to be pretty successful and effective.
Perhaps Trump without the circus and the narcissism.
That's exactly what I would do.
Yeah, I guess a couple of things come to me that, one is Trumpism without the circus. Do the Trump supporters go away then? And I guess I also want to come back to your point about the age distribution that, you had said the Democrats need to appeal to Gen Z and seem to be doing that, but need to continue to do that. Is there something the Republicans can do to appeal to Gen Z? The Republicans face, frankly, their voter base is dying out in some ways, not to be too morbid about it, but is there something the Republicans can do to appeal to Gen Z that's consistent with their brand?
Well, yeah, that's always going to be a problem for conservatives, it's the old age saying, liberal while you learn, conservative while you earn. As people continue young people overwhelmingly go towards liberal policies. Of course, not everyone. We do have some Gen Z who overwhelmingly support Trump, and Republicans, of course, but more than likely, they're going to support more liberal policies, and older people are going to support more conservative policies. I would say in order to, for now, as while Gen Z is still very, very young, where some of us are still teenagers, you need to come up with a way to palette your policies in a more, I would say, less extreme way. So it would be those moderate Republicans that would appeal to Gen Z more than someone who is way, way extreme than Trump. That's what I would think. I would really, appeal to Gen Z with moderation if you were a Republican.
And that might mean trying to appeal more to LGBTQ voters. And I think that's something Democrats need to emphasize in the next couple of years, but that is something I think Republicans can also do. I think most Republicans are not going to move off the abortion issue. Many are pro-life, and that's the way they're going to be. But if they can open up their mind a little bit and appeal more to LGBTQ voters, that might help them attract more Gen Z voters. Again, Democrats, I think, need to do the same thing.
Yeah, but it's also another point I wanted to mention is that a lot of, my generation who is, 18 plus, we have a lot of financial insecurity. Are we ever going to own a home? Are we ever going to get off the student loan debt that is crushing us right now? Are we ever going to have a job that is going to sustain us? All of these issues, healthcare, there's a lot of financial uncertainty. If Republicans were able to give us good answers and good questions and maybe, hype up the idea, we're a capitalist economy and it can still work, and they show us that it can still work, I think that would mobilize a lot of Gen Z people to, okay, you're giving me an option and I can support some of my conservative values, but like I said, we're young and we're uncertain about our financial future, and it's scaring us, and the Democrats are giving us, affordable health care. We have some policies to address the housing crisis. As a Gen Z, I'm like, thank you. I kind of need that help because I am scared right now and I'm getting out of college and I need that extra support. Republicans need to lend out a hand, but they're not historically willing to do that. So I think that's what they need to do.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead, Keith.
Well, no, along that lines, I mean, like Rich, I'm kind of old, and I'm just thinking about when I started teaching
Well,
political.
I'm not kind of old. I am old.
Well, okay,
You're kind of
I'm
old.
only kind of old, but so I think about when I started teaching political science, and this is in the mid '80s, and we're kind of coming out of a period of stagflation, and the economy is struggling. Then you have Reagan, and a lot of my students then were pretty bought into Reagan, and he was popular, and they saw that as the way to go, and the Republicans. And so I think it was interesting what you're saying about if the Republicans offer an economic message, there's a way you can buy a house, here's a way you can get out, here you have a dynamic economy where you can get a good job and those kinds of things. That might be an appealing message. So I found that really resonated with my experience. So we've also a little bit touched on this, and I always complain to my students, and I guess this also goes to Rich's point about the media looking at the horse race, but I always complain to my students, we shouldn't spend so long on presidential elections. We spend half of our life talking about who's going to be the next president, and so immediately after this midterm, now we're back here, let's talk about who's going to be the next president. So I hate that, but let's do it anyway. So who's going to be the next president? What does the midterm election tell us about what's going to happen next, the presidential election? How is that playing out?
I don't know if I can look to the midterm election because, based off, I always went on historical backing, but now I'm confused because it didn't go exactly what I thought it was going to go that, based off what I knew. So I don't know. I do see foresee in the 2024 election a schism between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. That is my prediction. I don't know who they're going to go with, but I think that would probably be the big news. Do you stick with Trump or do you try out this new guy who absolutely dominated Florida? And, I think that's appealing. So that would be mine.
I would say 2 years out, it's just way too difficult to predict. There's a lot that can happen between now and then. There's a lot of dirt that can get dug up on DeSantis between now and then. And you certainly know Trump will be there with a shovel in hand trying to dig up some of that dirt. And with Biden, how do things unfold the next couple years in this country? Some of the issues you're talking about, Delilah, can we reach some sort of resolution, especially with this divided House and Senate and presidency? Can we get some solutions to some of these questions that are nagging Gen Z and other Americans? And then who takes credit for that? And who has the loudest voice, the squeaky wheel, and gets the credit? And will Democrats be willing to support Biden for another term in office, or are we going to see a challenge to him within his own party? Well, you rarely see that with a sitting president, but occasionally that does happen. And depending on how the performance is, perhaps in the next year or so, 6 months or year, and certainly the questions about his age, perhaps we'll see a challenge within the Democratic Party.
Joe Biden, and one thing I was wanting to mention, even in the 2020 election, Joe Biden has never been extremely popular in the Democratic realm. He was, the narrative that the media would like to just say is that he was an alternative to Trump, and he was the best alternative that we got. I'm not sure that as Gen Z and millennials and things become more polarized, if he's going to be the attractive option anymore. Due to his age and, some things that he just says, it's just, he's just out of it sometimes, and maybe he's just too moderate for what people will want, especially in the presidential election, because we've seen how dire people will go and how the depths and how far they will go to secure an election, especially with the election deniers in 2020. So I don't know what the Democrats are going to do about Joe Biden per se. I just know that I don't think he is exactly the most popular option within the Democratic sphere.
DeSantis on the Republican side is in his mid-40s. Mm-hmm. Is that enough to be attractive to some Gen Z voters?
I would agree. I do think it's especially, I'm kind of in a fishbowl. I have a lot of political science friends and things like that. And we're always wondering, we're always wanting younger people to represent us. We're like, why are people that were born 90 years ago, that weren't even like, I wasn't even a thought my mother wasn't even a thought when they were born, and they are telling me and controlling Congress. So I do like the idea of a younger person. That's me personally, and I think a lot of my friends and political science friends like the idea of youth. But we're not remiss to say that youth doesn't always make the best candidate. We want who is the best. So think about it, for example, Bernie Sanders is about the same age as Joe Biden and Donald Trump. He was extremely popular with Gen Z when we just turned 18 and 19, and it's our first time voting in the 2018 election, 2016 election. And he was very popular, but he was very old. So I don't think that it's necessarily going to be the tipping point, but it is something we keep in the back of our minds.
Bernie had the ideas of wiping out student loan debt, right?
100%.
And that obviously is very popular with Gen
And he
Z.
is very old, so.
Well, I mean, taking Rich's excellent point that it's really a lot early to make too many predictions, and also trying to keep in mind what I said about not getting too caught up in the narrative, it does look like the midterms reinforced Joe Biden's position in the Democratic Party, because the Democrats didn't do as badly as people expected, and people said, all right, maybe Joe Biden's okay. Do you think that strengthens his position for 2024, the outcome of these elections?
Can you ask that again, rephrase that?
Well, yeah, let me do it in a less wordy way. So the Democrats did better than expected. Does that reinforce Biden's position? So Biden was seen as kind of a drag on the ticket. That didn't really happen. Does that reinforce his position as a viable candidate for 2024?
He would certainly make that case, I think.
Yeah, I would have. It's going back to, I hope I'm not like phrasing this wrong, but did the Democrats win big or did the Republicans lose big? And so it's going back to the fact that, Democrats are, applauding, oh, we did okay, or is it that the Republicans really, really fumbled the bag this time around? I don't know exactly. So I think that's what is the big issue, and that'll determine in 2024, what happens.
Well, and if Trump ends up being the Republican nominee for president, Biden has proven he can defeat Trump, and that would be a case he could make as we go along here.
That's true.
Maybe turning to Illinois a little bit. So the Democrats did very well. J.B. Pritzker was elected or reelected. The entire Democratic slate of statewide offices, including U.S. Senate, went to the Democrats. Democrats won 14 of 17 congressional seats. They also did very well in the state legislative races. One thing that struck me in looking at the results is the increasing urban-rural divide in Illinois, and we can see that in other states as well. Was there anything that surprised you about the Illinois results? And do you think the parties in Illinois need to do anything different to be more appealing to the voters?
What surprised me, looking at the 17th congressional district, where Eric Sorensen, the Democrat, defeated Republican Esther Joy King, the larger communities, as expected, went for the Democrat Sorensen, Bloomington Normal, Peoria, Rock Island, Rockford. But here in McDonough County, Esther Joy King won by just like 36 votes over Sorensen, if I read that correctly. And that seems like a very, very close margin where she really needed to do well in rural areas such as McDonough County, especially in such a close race, and she faltered there. And I don't know what the issue was there. I will say, I never really heard, getting back to this idea with Republicans, I did not hear any ideas from her campaign, but every day in my mailbox was some sort of negative ad about Eric Sorensen, and that may have worn on voters a little bit. This constant, negativity, I think, wears a little bit after a while. Again, I would like to hear ideas. I certainly understand negative campaigning seems to work well a lot, but I think mixed in with that negative campaigning, you need to present some ideas. I'm just surprised it was such a close contest in McDonough County, which is so heavily Republican.
Anything surprise you in Illinois, Delilah?
Not quite. I did expect the Pritzker-Bailey race to be more eventual. Like, I thought that it was going to be based off what I've been doing and my research in rural counties and my experience in rural counties and living in rural counties. It's been very, very overwhelmingly, we want to get Pritzker out. And so I thought, oh, this is going to be some type of big event. And Pritzker absolutely annihilated Darren Bailey. I mean, there was no contest. So I think that surprised me. I thought that the rural voters would show up because we have before. A lot of people, constantly say, oh, you can't win and, with, Cook County and things like that. I'm like, no, we had Rauner, we had Bruce Rauner. We can't, if you want a Republican force, it can happen. I just don't know, especially with the advent of the economy and rural towns really, really struggling. Food insecurity has been something that I've been looking at a lot and researching. It's been really, really ravishing these, rural counties and rural places. So I thought it would be more of an event, and it wasn't.
That partly might be because Bailey is seen as such an extremist. You may have had some moderate Republicans who just simply didn't vote in that race.
Yes, that's what I think you're probably correct, because I thought it would be a show out, but it really wasn't.
Well, I mean, Pritzker did not do as well in rural Illinois, or at least downstate Illinois, I should say, as he did in 2018. I was looking at some of the county results. In 2018, he won 8 downstate counties. This time he won only 4. And they were mainly urbanized counties like Rock Island, Peoria, McLean, and Champaign. So those are really the more urban areas. But I was looking back, and kind of interestingly, for a point of comparison, Rod Blagojevich in 2006 won 26 downstate counties, which is quite a bit more, so a little bit surprising there.
What were people thinking?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was his slogan, as you recall. Well, let's wrap this up by talking about governing and what happens next after the midterm elections. So it looks like the Republicans will take control of the House of Representatives. We're talking a week after the election, and it hasn't been definitively called yet, but I think the indications are the Republicans will take control of the House. The Democrats will keep the Senate, not sure by what margin until the Georgia runoff. How does the split control of the 2 houses of Congress affect the ability to govern? What kind of issues will the parties clash on? Will there be any areas of agreement, do you think, that are we looking at another 2 years of stasis until the next presidential election? So what do you think in terms of governing going forward?
Well, I would imagine Schumer will continue to run the Senate. I guess the question is who is going to be the House Speaker? We know McCarthy wants it. I believe there is some opposition within Republican ranks to him. I think part of it might depend on who ends up being the House Speaker.
Okay.
Yeah, I would pretty much agree 100% with what you have to say. I do think a lot of Democrats are discussing about judicial appointments. If that could be a thing, that might shake things up a bit. But ultimately, I don't see much more of a stasis. I hope that they're, for the Democratic side, that they continue to push states to codify Roe v. Wade and insulin prices and things healthcare related, especially post-COVID. So I think that there may be some updates with that, but for the most part, I see a stasis.
We've seen the courts politicized in recent years or decades. Does that make control of the Senate that much more important since senators approve judicial appointments?
I would agree. I would agree that I think we're seeing a turning point. You mentioned in the last couple of, midterm elections, people are starting to wake up and see how important it is who your governor, who your senator, who your House of Representatives are. And I think that that is really important. And I do appreciate that, obviously as a political scientist, but just as a voter in general and someone who wants to see change, I'm like explaining to people who maybe didn't vote, this is where it starts. It starts here. And it's not always just about the presidential election. He's got to have somebody to back him. That's where the Senate and the House come. So I think that that's important.
It's not always about the presidential election, and we should mention there are, between now and the next round of national elections, we have municipal elections coming up on Tuesday, April 4th, and people will choose, mayors, village presidents, local council people, park board, school board, that type of thing, where you can really have some influence and say, and those are usually the very low turnout elections. And I would encourage people to get to know who the candidates are running in contested elections for some of these municipal elections, and get out and vote on April 4th.
Yeah, those can have a very big impact, obviously. I guess along the lines of the agenda going forward, I wanted to drill down on a few issues and just see if you had any thoughts about what might happen. So one thing that's been talked about a lot is the national debt ceiling. That needs to be raised at some point in 2023, or else the United States will not be able to pay its bills. There's been some talk that if Republicans control the House, they might extract concessions. And so it's possible that Democrats might raise the national debt ceiling during the lame duck session, although President Biden has said he doesn't really think that should happen. Another issue that's kind of lingering out there is revisions to the Electoral Count Act, which would clarify the process of counting the electoral votes. So among other things, would make it clear that the vice president plays only a ceremonial role, that states can't step in after the vote has occurred and say, oh, we were just kidding, these are our real electoral votes, or something like that. And immigration is also another thing that's kind of lingering out there, and there's some legislation pending that would clarify the asylum process at the border, which is kind of overwhelmed right now, and would perhaps provide more agricultural visas to deal with shortages of farm workers. Do you think Congress will act on any of these specific issues, like the national debt ceiling, the Electoral Count Act, immigration? Do you see anything happening on any of these?
I feel like with the electoral count, had this election round gone differently or more tumultuous or violent, that would have probably been like a hotter ticket. But since it kind of fizzled, I think that it's going to probably fizzle, especially since Joe Biden has he's not said a whole lot about that, especially in his platform. So that's what I would say.
I would hope they would take up that sort of issue so we don't see a repeat of 2020, but we may just sit on our hands and let something, whatever unfolds in 2024, and that would be disappointing if we have to go through something like that again.
Do you think Congress will be able to act on immigration? I mean, it's been years and it's been stalemate, but...
That's going to take a lot of compromise and a lot of talking. And again, if you can achieve something when you have split government like this, then who's going to take credit for it? Now, both sides are going to claim credit, but can we work out some sort of compromise? I would say that's difficult. Let's hope they can get something done. Well, that's why we're sending them there, right? Is to get some work done, not just to bicker, but to get some work done. So let's hope they address some of these issues.
Well, any last thoughts before we conclude our discussion today?
Thanks for inviting me to join the panel here today.
I also really, really appreciate it. And I hope people are continuing to have these conversations at home. And, even though the midterm season is over and, we've got a lot of people are just happy to stop getting stuff in their mailboxes and their text messages, but I want people to continue to have this conversation because, as Americans and voters, it's going to come up. It's seasonal. Keep having these conversations and keep, thinking about who you want to represent you.
And when people announce they're going to run, ask them questions. Yeah. Show up at a campaign appearance or League of Women Voters, Candidates Forum, anything like that. Ask questions. They want to be the representatives in your government. They want to have some sort of say in how your tax dollars are spent. They should be willing to answer questions from you. And I would like to see more candidates showing up for candidate forums and answering questions from the general public.
And going back to the Gen Z thing, I guess my final comment is Gen Z run for office. I mean, I am far from Gen Z, but I would like to see more younger people. I think there are too many geriatric figures out there in politics now. And so Gen Z run for office, get out there, maybe starting with the local elections or whatever. Well, this has been a very interesting discussion, informative discussion. I'd like to thank our panelists again, Delilah Sanders and Rich Egger. Thank you, Greg Baldry, for organizing this, and I hope that you will stay tuned for future episodes of this series, Explorations in Political Science. Thank you.